Anyone who has ever spread a rumor knows that the best rumors are never fully fake. If they were completely false, they would be too easy to check, too easy to knock down, too easy to expose. The rumors that survive for centuries usually carry just the right amount of blur. They sound true, they travel even more smoothly than the truth. And after a while, they start to feel more real than reality itself. On the eve of the French Revolution, there was one line with an absurd level of destructive power. The people had no bread, and the queen supposedly said, "Then let them eat cake," more precisely, let them eat brioche. The problem is that Marie Antoinette most likely never said it. But the line still got hammered into her name, into the public memory of the French Revolution, and into one of the most enduring images of the old regime. Welcome to my channel. This is To the Lighthouse. Today, I want to talk about one of the most famous fake news stories in history. Who actually said this line, why it got pinned onto Marie Antoinette, and why a rumor that may not have been true still became one of the most successful political slogans of the French Revolution. The quote. Let us start with the obvious question. Did Marie Antoinette actually say, "Let them eat cake"? As far as reliable evidence goes, no. There is no solid proof that the phrase can be confidently attributed to her. The version most historians accept today is that this line was floating around long before it attached itself to her reputation. A similar remark appears in Rousseau's Confessions. Rousseau writes about a great princess who, upon hearing that the peasants had no bread, said they should eat brioche instead. But here is the catch. When Rousseau wrote that passage, Marie Antoinette was still a child. The ages simply do not match, which means the line was most likely not invented by her at all. It was attached to her later, the way people today casually misattribute quotes to Shakespeare, Einstein, Mark Twain whenever they need a famous name to carry a sentence, and this is where the whole story becomes deliciously ironic. Rousseau was not just any writer. He was the author of The Social Contract and Confessions. He helped give modern politics its language of the people, and he also helped give modern literature its language of the self. The French Revolution later borrowed heavily from Rousseau's vocabulary, his emotional structure, even his moral imagination. History textbooks love telling that part. What they mention less often is that one of the most famous stupid things ever attributed to a queen may also trace back, indirectly, to Rousseau's pages. History loves that kind of dark joke. It takes a long detour and then quietly stabs you with irony. But the more interesting question is not whether she said it. The more interesting question is why everyone was so ready to believe she had. When a line sticks so neatly to a person, it usually means the public had already built that person into the kind of character who would say exactly that. The Queen. Marie Antoinette was almost too perfect as a villain. She was born an Austrian archduchess and married into the French royal family, which meant she arrived already carrying the stigma of being foreign. Late 18th century, France was becoming increasingly hostile toward the court, increasingly suspicious of the monarchy, increasingly exhausted by privilege. And in the middle of all that, the Queen was young, visible, fashionable, and expensive. Her hairstyles were easier to gossip about than tax policy. Her dresses were easier to resent than structural debt. Her jewels, entertainments, and image at court were concrete. A fiscal crisis is abstract. A queen's wardrobe is not. State insolvency takes paragraphs to explain. A silk gown takes one glance. And France at this moment was already sliding into a deep structural crisis. French support for the American War of Independence had worsened the financial burden. The tax system remained wildly unequal. Reform efforts kept stalling. Finance ministers such as Necker rose and fell in an atmosphere of panic and mistrust. The monarchy increasingly looked like a machine, with gold leaf on the outside and broken gears on the inside. In that environment, the Queen became a perfect emotional outlet. She was not necessarily the true architect of the system, but she was by far the easiest face to see, and the easiest face to hate. What makes this even more fascinating is that literature from the same period had already been training the public to peel away aristocratic dignity and reveal absurdity underneath. Beaumarchais, in The Marriage of Figaro, openly mocked noble privilege and pushed one dangerous question to the center of the stage. Why should someone enjoy everything simply because they were born into the right family? Laclos, in Dangerous Liaisons, turned elite society into a machine powered by seduction, calculation, vanity, and masks. Even when the characters spoke the language of refinement, the moral world underneath was predatory. So before the revolution exploded politically, French culture had already been rehearsing something psychologically. It had been practicing how to see respectable people as ridiculous people, how to translate courtly elegance into fraud, and how to look at the upper classes and suspect rot under the perfume. By the time Marie Antoinette became the target, the audience was ready. The stage had already been lit. Rumor machine. And this is where the story starts feeling very modern. 18th century France did not have social media, but it absolutely had information pollution. The period was full of libelous pamphlets, slanderous texts, underground print culture, gossip networks, and semi-pornographic political writing. If you squint, it starts to look uncomfortably familiar. Today, we have viral posts, rage bait, clipped quotes, fake screenshots, and emotionally engineered headlines. They had pamphlets sold on the street, whispered stories in salons and cafes, and a thriving market for scandal. Marie Antoinette was one of the great victims of this ecosystem. She was repeatedly portrayed as sexually corrupt, financially reckless, politically manipulative, and disloyal to France. Her body, her marriage, her friendships, and her private life were all turned into raw material for public fantasy. Some pamphlets accused her of adultery. Others turned her into a foreign conspirator. Others blurred pornography and political satire so completely that the result was not really argument at all, but character assassination disguised as entertainment. What makes this especially painful is that the Enlightenment really did expand public debate in France. It helped create a broader space for discussion, criticism, and circulation of ideas. Voltaire used wit to attack religious and political authority. Diderot and D'Alembert assembled the Encyclopédie as an audacious act of intellectual organization. Montesquieu dissected power in the spirit of the laws. Rousseau made the language of popular sovereignty emotionally explosive. But once that public sphere opened up, it did not fill itself only with philosophy and noble argument, it also filled itself with trash. Cheap trash, addictive trash, highly shareable trash. That is one of the most enduring lessons of modern media history. Open discussion does not automatically produce reason, it also produces spectacle. It produces slander. It produces content optimized for emotion. Once the machinery of circulation expands, it will not be run only by philosophers and playwrights. It will also be run by hacks, opportunists, provocateurs, and people who understand perfectly well that outrage travels faster than evidence. Which is why the line, "Let them eat cake," was so powerful. Not because it was proven, but because it was perfectly shaped for the media environment around it. It was short. It was cruel. It was memorable. It insulted the hungry with a sentence simple enough for anyone to repeat. It required no explanation of tax failures, grain prices, debt, ministerial paralysis, or royal mismanagement. Compared with discussing state finance, one nasty line is far more portable. Human beings have always been more loyal to stories than to spreadsheets. The necklace. If the pamphlets were a slow simmer, the diamond necklace affair was a pan thrown straight into fire. In 1785, French jewelers were desperate to sell a staggeringly expensive diamond necklace. A con artist, Jean de la Motte, manipulated Cardinal de Rohan, who was eager to regain the Queen's favor. Through forged letters and a staged fake meeting, he was led to believe he was secretly helping Marie Antoinette purchase the necklace. Once he received it, he handed it off to the fraudsters, who quickly broke it apart and sold the diamonds. When the jewelers did not get paid, the whole thing exploded into public scandal. Marie Antoinette herself had not actually participated in the fraud, but the public did not remember the fine print. They remembered queen, diamonds, luxury, court scandal, and that was enough. Her reputation was drained even further. This scandal did more than damage one queen. It stripped another layer off the dignity of the monarchy itself. The queen was unfairly entangled in it, yes, but the crown still paid the price, in public trust. Reform was already blocked, finances were already collapsing, And now the court seemed to be floating inside a haze of diamonds and absurdity, while the country lurched toward disaster. The symbolism was devastating. A kingdom drifting toward bankruptcy while rumor after rumor swirled around jewels, privilege, and the appetites of the elite. At that point, the public portrait was nearly complete. Marie Antoinette had become, in the minds of many French people, the embodiment of waste, distance, and aristocratic detachment. So when the phrase, "let them eat cake," later fastened itself to her, it did not feel like a wild accusation. It felt like the final detail on a face already painted. That is what makes political rumor so frightening. Very often, it does not win because it introduces a new image. It wins because it confirms an image people were already emotionally invested in. Once society accepts the premise that a public figure is vain, heartless, corrupt, or out of touch, adding one more quote to their mouth feels less like invention and more like completion. Revolution story. Of course, the French Revolution was not caused by gossip alone. That would be far too simple, and frankly a little insulting to history. Beneath the spectacle were hard realities. Grain prices were rising. The tax system was deeply unfair. State debt was severe. Reform had failed again and again. Royal authority was eroding. The social contract between ruler and ruled was breaking down in full view. None of those facts can be skipped, but facts alone do not mobilize crowds. They need translation. They need to be turned into scenes, symbols, and repeatable stories. They need an image that condenses the structure into a sentence. And that is exactly what Let Them Eat Cake did. It compressed a massive structural crisis into one insult. It translated the arrogance of the old regime into one line that anybody could understand. It transformed questions of bread, taxation, hierarchy, and power into a single emotional flash. A hungry person did not need to have read Rousseau, Montesquieu, Voltaire, or the Encyclopédie to understand the contempt inside that sentence. Political communication is often most effective not when it is most complex, but when it can flatten a complex reality into one unforgettable phrase. That is also why revolutions generate myths. Not because revolutionaries are uniquely indifferent to truth, but because mass politics naturally gravitates towards symbols. Marie Antoinette gradually stopped being just a person. She became a device. She became foreignness, luxury, court corruption, class coldness, and the opposite of popular suffering. Once a person is processed into that kind of political symbol, factual precision begins to fade into the background. The real question becomes whether the symbol can ignite people. Later writers understood this very well. Dickens, in A Tale of Two Cities, captured the emotional logic of revolutionary vengeance with remarkable force. That novel is not a documentary, but it understands something essential. Long before institutions fall, language changes, resentment thickens, faces become emblems, suffering seeks a figure to punish. Before the fire fully arrives, what flies first are usually sentences. Short ones, sharp ones, cruel ones. And if I can be a little personal here, this is one reason I find the whole story so fascinating. I have always loved literature that sits right on the edge between the private and the political, where a rumor about one person starts revealing the structure of an entire society. That is part of why I keep coming back to writers like Rousseau, Dickens, Flaubert, even Balzac. They all understood, in different ways, that public narratives are never just about facts. They are about what a society is ready to feel. True fire. So after all that, we arrive at the strangest and coldest part of the story. The real issue is not whether Marie Antoinette said the sentence. The real issue is that French society deeply needed her to have said it. That is what makes this rumor so chilling. It does not merely reveal the vulnerability of one queen. It reveals a brutal rule of modern political communication. Facts are not always the most powerful thing. The most powerful thing is often the story that can compress a whole social crisis into one emotional slogan. The pamphlets, theater, salon chatter, and street gossip of 18th century France are not as far from our own media world as we might like to believe. The technology has changed, human nature has not. We still clip, simplify, moralize, and pass around stories that feel truer than reality because they satisfy the emotional shape we already want. We still reward narratives that convert systems into villains and complexity into one memorable quote. Marie Antoinette did not die simply because of a rumor. She died in the collapse of an old regime. She died in the context of fiscal crisis, political failure, international tension, royal misjudgment, and revolutionary acceleration. But the rumor helped history perform one crucial operation. It packed an enormous web of problems into the face of one woman, and once that happened, opposing a system started to look very much like punishing a symbol. That is why the phrase survives. Not because it is true, but because it feels perfectly tailored to our imagination of power. Power, in the popular imagination, should be stupid. It should be cold. It should be detached from ordinary life. It should say something grotesquely insulting when people are hungry. As long as that expectation remains emotionally satisfying, truth slowly exits the stage, and story takes over history. And that, really, is the long afterlife of "Let them eat cake." Not a sentence spoken by a queen, but a sentence spoken by an entire age through her. A line that may have been false, in fact, but true in feeling for millions who needed a symbol of everything rotten in the old world. That is how propaganda works at its most elegant and most terrifying. It does not always invent from nothing. Sometimes it simply finds the right mask for a fear, a hatred, or a hunger that is already there. If you enjoyed today's video, do not forget to like and subscribe. See you at the next lighthouse.